air, fire, animals, plants, and our ancestors. The Anishinaabe peoples have utilized this land for millennia, and we would like to acknowledge their direct descendants, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as the rightful caretakers and title holders of this land upon which we live, work, and conduct ourselves. We acknowledge our treaty relationship and responsibilities to both the land and these original peoples. We also recognize that this land is rich in pre-contact history and customs, which include the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, and since European contact has and continues to become home for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And it is in the spirit and intent of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, whereby we will collectively care for and respect the land, water, animals, and each other in the interests of peace and friendship, and for the benefit of not only ourselves, but of our future descendants. So the technology for this call, I'll go over it quite quickly. You're to use the chat box to ask any questions. You can find that in the bottom of your screen. You can privately message the host. Simply choose the Halton Environmental Network or Oakville Ready, and we are here to answer any questions. Great. Next slide. So please use the chat box to ask questions. Like I said, please take care of yourself. Share the air and chat box space. Question ideas, not people. Call people in, not out. If you need additional COVID-19 support, please visit www.halton.ca or dial 311. Now, I'm going to turn over to Tricia Henderson to tell us a little bit more about Oakville Ready.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to take a brief moment to describe the Oakville Ready program, which is kind of the platform in the program that has brought us here today. So about a year and a half ago, the town of Oakville and the Halton Environment Network set out to establish a neighborhood resiliency-based program. We were generously funded by the Oakville Community Foundation, and our goal was to establish 6 resiliency hubs within vulnerable neighborhoods of Oakville. These hubs are to serve as a short-term refuge in times of localized flooding, high wind, power outages, ice storms, severe winter events, or house fires. This really is a neighbor helping neighbors program, and we're trying to build community resilience and decrease the vulnerability of our population by building this community and this social network. So as I mentioned, the Oakville Ready program was put into place really to deal with that first 1 to 4 hours after an extreme weather event. We are noticing an increase in the frequency and the severity of some of these extreme weather events that, as I mentioned, include high wind events, freezing rain, general winter storms, flooding, and the impacts of these are often power outages, damage to home property, and in severe cases, human life. So what would happen in the instance of just say a localized flooding event, we would locate the nearest resiliency hub, which is a faith-based organization within town, and we would open their doors. You would be able to go there to get some communication with the town on when this problem is going to be resolved, maybe to charge your electronics, get a warm cup of tea, and really just socialize with your neighbors. We do know that building community resilience through this means really does help to relieve anxiety and stress of people that are going through these emergency type of situations. So our goal was to enact 6 hubs within the first year, and we ended up going with 7. We blanketed the whole town and approached every faith-based organization within Oakville to take part in the program. And we chose these 7 as our first cohort to the pilot project. They were chosen based on their abilities to participate in the program, details about their facility and their location throughout town. As I mentioned, this is a program of in partnership with Halton Environment Network and the town of Oakville, but we have received additional supports from Halton Region, Faith in the Common Good, and Crew. So I mentioned Oakville Ready was put into place to deal with extreme weather events and our changing climate, but in light of COVID-19 and the requirements for physical distancing, we really have pivoted the program. And what we're trying to do now is use the Oakville Ready program as a platform to provide a virtual community of support. So we have been working with our faith-based organizations and providing them some technical support to put their services online, and not only their faith services, but also things like their book clubs and wine groups, things like that. Through our website and our Twitter account, we have provided a lot of helpful information on things to do to keep busy while we're all stuck at home, and some helpful tips of where you can go to get some more information. We urge you to contact halton.ca or dial 311 if you have any questions directly related to the pandemic. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Nancy Robertson. Nancy, in spite of being a very busy and successful realtor here in Oakville, she continues to find time to give back to her community that she loves. Nancy sits on the Mayor's Committee, Leaders Roundtable, and she is the president of the Chartwell Maple Grove Residents Association. Prior to moving to Ontario, Nancy lived in British Columbia, where her love of gardening was fostered at UBC. She enrolled in their Master Gardeners program, and she went on further to achieve a landscape design diploma. Nancy's gardens have won landscape awards in British Columbia, and her work has been included in garden tours both here in Ontario and out in BC. Gardening, unfortunately, has had to take a bit of a back seat to her as her business in realty is booming. But as Nancy states, once a gardener, always a gardener, which is why she is here with us today to help the Halton Environment Network with this gardening webinar. So we're going to begin by watching just a short video of Nancy as she prepares her garden for the spring. And welcome, Nancy. Thank you. Lisa's on the video.
I don't have sound.
It's early spring because the magnolias about to bloom. The rhododendrons have budded, and you can see the purple in the buds. And over here, you can see the hellebores that are in full bloom. Spring cleanup would include trimming off this kind of dead plant material from last fall. And you would sweep, carefully rake up the leaves around your perennials. You have to be very careful. Number one, you've got to worry about compacting the soil, so you want to be careful about trampling back and forth on it. And then you also have to be careful that you don't step on any of the new buds. And you can see that obviously somebody has stepped on it. One of the big spring chores, which I find incredibly meditative, is pruning. This hydrangea on my right needs pruning at this time of year, but this Japanese maple will not be pruned at all, ever. Should always be left planted as it is. When we get to the back, we're going to talk about garden design. But up here is a classic example of how you need structure in a garden. So we've created structure by bringing in the big boulders and the hardscaping of the flagstone pathway. Very important part in a successful garden design is to incorporate some of that in with your plant material. It's never just about the plant material. So spring is my favorite time, one of my favorite times of the year. They're all my favorites, really. And gardeners will like every time of the year. But you can see where the sedum in the back there needs to have the old dead flower heads from the fall pruned off. And then if you come around, you'll see, you know, things, little bits of tidying like this to be done. And then, but you gotta love the spring. Look at the colors. And look at the texture, because gardening is about texture too. So look at the textures. Over here on this side, we have a very mature lavender bush. And, you know, lavender is almost not hardy here in our, depending on where it is planted in your garden. But this all can be pruned off. And then you're left with a beautiful shrub that will bloom later in the summer. So you can see we have a giant perennial grass here. It's one of the miscanthus. It was pruned back in the fall. It could be left through the winter time, and you'll see one in the back garden that we left. So this is all, the pruning's all done here. There's nothing more to do. You'll see some green shoots coming up. So at this corner of the garden, I just want to point out that the viburnum in the back doesn't get pruned at all. The hydrangea will get pruned. Now that hydrangea is a very mature old hydrangea bush. I love it to death. It will probably take me an hour and a half to 2 hours to prune that. And this is a lilac bush, and it's about to flower. So we're not going to touch that at all until after it's bloomed. And then if you just look beyond the red chairs, you can see there's a miscanthus, one of the perennial grasses I have. That one is unpruned, and I left it like that because it kind of is interesting all through the fall and through the winter. But now I've got to prune it back in the spring in order for the new leaves to grow into the plant. Let's continue the discussion about pruning, shall we? Pruning a hydrangea takes time. In fact, pruning most shrubs do take time. The general rule is 30% max. Hydrangeas bloom, these are PGs, they're almost tree-like, and they bloom on new wood. So in the early spring, you prune them back, and you're pruning to control growth and also to encourage blossoms where you want them. So this shrub has not been pruned yet. They were both about the same age, or same height rather. And you can see how I've pruned it to give it a little bit of room in the inside, so lots of sunshine and air can get in the inside. I've pruned out dead wood, and then I've carefully selected where I want the growth. I want a little bit of height, and then I want to fill out in the middle. The thing about pruning is that, in fact, you're not pruning to keep it short. Pruning is done in order to encourage growth. So if you actually look at this shrub that hasn't been pruned, you can see where I pruned it before. There's the cutting from the cut mark from last year, and you can see 2 branches came out from that cutting, where I cut, because there's 2 nodes on either side of the branch. So you actually, when you prune, you're pruning to encourage growth, and that's really important to know. All right, just for as an example, for those of you who are about to prune your hydrangea or your rose bush, I know it takes great courage to make that first cut. And I know that from my own personal experience. I have that same issue. So let's just give, as an example, let's take this shrub. And 2 years ago, last year, I gave it a very light pruning. So this year, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive in the pruning because I need to control the overall size of the plant structure. And it might take me I don't know, a good half an hour to do this shrub. So I'm not going to do this for this demonstration, but I am going to show you that, for instance, I'm trying to be aggressive here. So I'm looking at this branch, I'm looking at the branch in the overall shrub, and I'm actually going to take this back right there, and you're going to cut it on an angle right above a growth node. See? So it's going to actually, two little branches will sprout out of that growth node moving forward. And then you're going to do that. Okay, so that's the first one. You're going to go up here and think, okay, if that's there, then I'm actually going to take this back, I think, right as far as that, because I would like to, you can see it's quite healthy and all ready to roll, and then you go all the way through your shrub that way. This garden is a mixture of, it's mostly a perennial garden. I do add annuals for color. I have planters that I always plant with annuals, and I will put blocks of color in the garden with annuals. Certainly we had a wedding last summer and we filled the garden with annuals. But for the most part, this is a perennial garden, so you can see that the plants have died right back and they're just starting to come back. People make a mistake when they're doing their garden, a first-time gardener, for instance, and they'll only put one of a certain plant in the garden. You need a little bit of size, so you got to plant more than one perennial in order for it to look good. So to finish this very brief garden tour, I want to talk about design in a garden, because there are some key elements to every garden, and it involves the structure. You have to always put the bones into the garden. It's like a house. The walls are the bones. Well, out here, the bones are the fencing, the trees, the evergreens, the pathways. And then in this garden, you know, we have red Muskoka chairs that definitely provide some visual point of interest. But you'll notice that we've got some evergreen shrub hedges all the way along that provides a really strong background to the plant material that's planted in front of it. And then in front of it, we have a combination of shrubs and perennials. And finally, one tip: if you're creating a garden where there was nothing before but grass, here's a very valuable tip. The most important part is you got to get rid of the turf. To scrape the turf off is hard work, and also it's got to go somewhere. So my suggestion is that you plot out your new garden with a hose, cover it with some sheets of newspaper, and like, you know, you're going to put a good batch of newspaper down, and then cover it with compost or manure and let the garden sit for, you know, 6 months. So you're doing some planning in advance. That will kill your grass. The worms will bring, it's a very environmentally friendly way to do things. The worms will come up and integrate your manure and your compost in through the newspaper. It works like a charm. I've done it over and over and over. Highly recommend. That's all I have to say. There's so much more that I could say, but I'm going to cut it short now. I'm happy to help. Reach out if you have any questions. Please have a wonderful spring. Enjoy your garden and stay safe and healthy.
So Nancy, we have a few follow-up questions for you about pruning.
Awesome. Shall we start with that, or do you want to start with a really simple question that was submitted to us earlier? Why don't we start with the simple one? Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Robertson. I'm happy to help out here. I'm hoping that I'm able to answer all of your questions. And if you stump me, I will promise to look the answer up, and in typical Master Gardener fashion, we'll look up the answer and then we'll get back to you. The first question was, we had some questions. We had 6 questions actually submitted prior to this webinar. The first one is actually so easy and it's so apropos. We were asked, what are the blue flowers that are blooming in people's lawns all over town? Those are Scilla siberica, Scilla, and they are they naturalize very well in your garden. And I never worry about mine. I just let them go. I know that some people find it a bit messy, but once it's bloomed, you just mow it down and they'll come back next year. So I think it's a bonus in your garden. I love them, and I wouldn't worry about taking them out or worrying about taking them out at all. Helen, pruning. I had questions too. What are yours?
Yes. Well, this is just a follow-up to your wonderful video, which did answer a lot of questions for me, but we seem to have a couple of follow-up ones. So one, how do you prune a Forsythia bush?
Well, Forsythia is one of those perennial shrubs, a deciduous shrub that actually is quite easy to look after. You've probably noticed they grow very easily around town. With Forsythia, you almost can't do anything wrong. You can be pretty aggressive with Forsythia and cut it right back. It falls into the in the same sort of situation as a spirea bush. They get sometimes just overgrown and they don't fit your space any longer. The rule with, as I said in the video, the rule with most pruning is 30% of the shrub at any one time. But I practice with my hydrangeas, my PG hydrangeas. I practice actually a hard aggressive prune 1 year and the lighter prune in year 2, and that controls the growth of the hydrangea. For Forsythia, I would actually, if it's a plant that's gotten too big for its space, which sometimes they do, spirea does that as well. I would actually be quite aggressive, and when you prune at least 30% of those long branches right down at the bottom. That will thin out the shrub. It's healthier for the shrub, and then you can prune the overall height of it and not worry whatsoever about hurting that particular shrub at all. The key is obviously do it right after it blooms, and that applies to most shrubbery. If it, like lilacs, you would never prune a lilac. My father used to prune the lilacs in the spring all the time just before it bloomed. It used to just drive my mother crazy. But so don't prune the lilacs until they have actually blossomed. Same with Forsythia and spirea, also the same. It will bloom in late spring, and you're going to be able to prune it right after it blossoms. And in fact, your spirea bush can be, I cut it right. I don't even follow the 30% rule. I actually cut it right back because it's in a tight little corner. If I had lots of space with a spirea, the shrub is a vase-like formation. And so if you can let it grow to its natural shape, it can be quite beautiful. But most people have planted the spirea in the too tight a location, and so they end up having to really give it an aggressive overall prune. I don't know if that helps at all. We did also get a pruning question online about a fruit tree. And this particular Nikki, this is Nikki, who was asking about her pear and her apple tree that are espaliered. Well, let me tell you, that is a very complicated question, Nikki. With fruit trees, generally speaking, you are choosing between old and young wood, and then you're also distinguishing which is a fruit spur, because you don't want to cut off the fruit spurs. So that is a question I'm actually going to follow up with you, because I'm going to give you a resource to look at. because online right now in this webinar it would be very, very difficult to answer.
Thanks for that. What would be the best time to prune a holly bush?
Holly, an evergreen like a holly should be pruned in the spring, early spring, now.
And for hydrangeas, somebody mentioned that theirs is quite tall and they haven't pruned it. So will that slow the growth if they don't prune it?
It won't slow the growth, but what happens is that, basically when you garden, you want the blooms and the garden to be basically in your face. So if it gets so tall and the blooms are way up high, you don't appreciate them right down where at eye level. So that's my only thing about pruning, and that's one of the reasons why I keep my hydrangea at that eye level, is because I want to be able to see the blossoms when I'm out walking. I don't want to have to look up. I want to see them right at my eye level.
So if somebody has a hydrangea at the correct height or a height that pleases them, they don't need to prune it?
No, they don't, but they will get leggy growth. Pruning is good for a shrub, mostly because it gets dense in, the growth is all on the outside of the bush, and that means that no sun is going on in the middle, and you're not getting any growth from the center. Eventually, you're going to get a shrub that is going to be what we call a leggy. It's gonna just have long branching with blossoms only at the end, and that might not be what you want.
I have one more question about pruning and then a couple of questions about bulbs. Somebody asked about cutting back raspberries.
Now there's lots of stuff about raspberries online. And I also have a book on pruning that talks about raspberries. Again, the raspberries, the resource on raspberries, there's a little bit of 2 times of raspberry pruning. In fact, you have to do a little bit in the fall after it's fruited, and then you do a little bit in the spring. So if you can get the name of that person, I'm going to direct them for the appropriate pruning instructions.
Yes, I will get back to them. That's great. So quite a few questions about planting summer bulbs. So are there any you plant now to have summer flowers, and any advice on planting them? So mostly about summer bulbs. What would they be? When do you plant them? And any advice for the actual planting?
Well, the most popular summer bulb is dahlia. And other, that would be one of, I think, and then the fall anemones would also be something. Most bulbs are actually planted, are spring, what people call spring bulbs, and are planted in the fall. Right now, there is a small selection. We can't get into the garden centers, so you're going to have to order these things online, and I'm not sure what's been brought into the garden centers. So I hesitate to kind of tell you what to do, but I know that if you Google summer bulbs, you'll get a huge list of what is possible, and then you just have to figure out what online is available through the garden centers, because you're not going to be able to go and choose. Other things that get, so in terms of bulb planting, the dominant time for bulb planting is in the fall.
Right, thank you. Is there a good time to spread grass seed? I'm seeing, I've seen, and I know this is a question here, isn't it too cold right now? Because I've seen a lot of my neighbors do it, and yet we're still having frosty nights.
Yes, it is too cold. It is too cold, but of course, people have time right now, so I certainly understand and sympathize with the enthusiasm in the garden. We've certainly seen, people spreading lots of topsoil down and top dressing their lawns, but it is too cold. In order for any seed to germinate outdoors, right now vegetable gardeners are doing everything inside still. You don't move it out. In Canada and in Ontario, May 24th is the weekend that everybody moves their annuals outside. Grass seed can actually go down, earlier than May 24th, generally speaking, but it's the evenings that have to be warm enough for the seed to germinate. It's all about germination of the grass seed. So if it's too cold, too wet, and too rainy, you risk that the seed will go moldy and just die, and it was a waste of time and effort. or it just sits dormant until it does warm up, but you might not then have the same sort of level of success rate. So my suggestion certainly would be to just keep an eye on the nighttime temperatures. Really, we have to be nighttime, 6 degrees, 7 degrees, 8 degrees, 10 degrees, really for a really successful planting of grass seed.
Now somebody asked about the benefits of a no-dig method for both a vegetable and a flower garden. So it's more not to actually start a garden, the method of it, but how is that beneficial for the soil? Why are they telling people to not dig anymore?
Because when you dig up a garden, you actually expose the seeds of weeds underneath. So one of the reasons why people have gone to the no digging is because it's not, you're creating work for yourself. So so that's number one. Number two is you risk damaging the root structure of your garden. So I think that, believe it or not, I think worms they're very organic, and the most organic way to actually look after your garden is to really encourage the worms to do the work for you. So this introduces, I'm surprised nobody's asked about mulch, but we do have a question about mulch here. But it does introduce the idea of mulching. And mulch does a couple of things. One, it tidies up your garden. So if you're looking for a way to really make your garden, freshen up your garden and really make it look sharp in the spring, mulch is a good way to do that. But the other additional thing with mulch is that it can provide natural fertilizer, so it replenishes the soil in your garden, and so you don't need to add an artificial fertilizer to give your soil, to condition your soil. And then a third thing would be that when you lay mulch down at the right time, so if you've already weeded, you put your mulch down, and if you're using a compost or a well-rotted manure, that will provide you with the fertilizer. But the next part about the mulch, if you're using a cedar shred, which people do use cedar, the blackened cedar on top, it makes the garden, they like the look of it, that will prevent weeds. So, mulch is one of the best things that you could do for your garden on so many levels. And of course, once you've got mulch down, you're not going to be digging in your garden. You don't need to. The worms are going to bring, the manure down into the soil, and you'll have done what you wanted to do, and all organically.
Were you able to answer that question about mulch? Do you want to segue into that, and we'll go back to the chat box?
Yes, well, good time, or one of the questions was about timing on mulch, and it really truly depends on what you're trying to do. So I don't fertilize my beds every year, so I do not bring compost, and when I order it, I order a half and half mix of compost and manure. And I do that because both of them are, provide some nutrients to the garden. And so the half and half mix goes down every 2 years in my gardens. And that's the only fertilizer, that's the only nutrients that I provide in my own garden. That's all I've done for years, and it's been perfectly fine. So a mulch like that is being used as a fertilizer, that kind of mulching can be done either in the fall or in the spring. It doesn't matter. You can do either or. The trick with that mulch is be careful, and all mulch, do not drown your plants. Don't be putting the mulch up right to the base of the plant or over the plant, because you just don't want to burn the plant with a manure that might be too strong. So I always keep it back a few inches from that root ball, and really I'm fertilizing the roots around the plant more than I'm, piling it on top of the plant. So that's from a fertilizer perspective. From the weed suppression, and also it's not just weed suppression, it actually cuts down on the amount of water that you need to put in your garden. That cedar chips that you might be putting down, and it's actually shredded. Don't use chips, they're not that great, but shredded wood mulch, and there's various kinds. It's, cedar mulch is probably the most expensive. I think the most natural color is the one that's as dark as possible, the color of your soil. That can go down, in the spring, and it will, once you've weeded, it will keep the weeds out of your garden, and that is a huge help for people.
Perfect. All right, we better get back to the chat box. It's blowing up, as the kids say. So, Ellen asks, over half her ornamental grasses did not grow back last year. She cut them back last week and pulled out as much of the dead material as possible. So will it come back?
So, oh yeah, there's still lots of time for the green growth. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that actually, ornamental grasses was one of the questions. So let's just talk, somebody asked about carex, and just, which is a sedge. Ornamental grasses are awesome. I love them. They do provide a design element that people consider is more modern, contemporary look. Certainly if it's in, if you do them in multiples and you've done a lovely grass bed, it has all sorts of texture, it blows the wind. I think ornamental grasses are fantastic. For the most part, they're in full sun. They're out in full sun. The only exception to that really is carex or sedge, which can tolerate a bit of shade. And I have sedge in my garden right in dead sun, and it's fine. I water it from time to time. It actually is. You don't really need to care for them much. I don't prune mine back generally in the fall. My lawn guy pruned those back that you saw in the film in the front. I wouldn't normally have pruned them back. I would let them just die right back. And right about now, I would go out and cut off all that dead foliage. On carex, on sedge, you don't prune them at all. You just pull out the dead plant material. You can easily just run your fingers over the plant and pull out some of the dead foliage without any trouble. But the big ornamentals, the big thing with ornamentals is they do need to be divided every sort of 5 years. They get really big. And it's a big job to divide a perennial ornamental grass. However, they are so beautiful, and they provide more than one season of growth. I mean, in the springtime really is their least attractive time, but then once the greenery starts, it shoots up, and you've got summer, fall, and winter where you have some interest in the garden because of that ornamental grass. So it's not too late. Prune it right now. Do not prune it to the ground. I would allow probably about 6 inches. If you don't see any green coming back up yet, I would allow 6 to 8 inches of at the bottom there, and then prune it back, and then be patient. They will come. They haven't died. It'd be very unusual to die.
Thanks. We have a question on Scilla, Scilla.
Yeah, which is what we talked about at the very beginning.
So this person is finding that it's killing everything around it. The root system is very dense. They no longer have any pachysandra in the front garden. Could the root system kill other plants?
No. What's happened is the Scilla has crowded out the pachysandra. And that's the only issue you have with Scilla, is that it can crowd things out. And that's when you would be a bit more aggressive. I have sweet woodruff, which is another ground cover, and I do pull it up from time to time if I find that it's crowded things out. So yeah, you'll have to pull out what you don't like. But in the lawn, I would let it go. I mean, I would just cut it back when the blooms are gone, and you start cutting your lawn.
Next, we have a couple questions about recommendations. So Anna, she would like to know if you could recommend a shrub that would flower most of the spring and summer that she could plant next to her deck that gets a lot of morning and afternoon sun.
No, there's so much to talk about. So when I make design recommendations, I always think about how much interest there will be from this plant year round. So to me, a plant that provides a very short amount of beauty, a week or two, like crabapple trees, I don't find them as valuable in the landscape. They're good for certain things, but I like plants that actually last over a good amount of time, so that there's lovely green chartreusey growth, for instance, in the spring. Then you get the blossoms coming in July. As they age, they turn different colors. So, and PG hydrangea fits that bill. That's why I use it a lot. For a shrub beside a deck, I would say that it's got to get high enough. So it's got to be a large enough shrub. So a PG hydrangea will fit that bill. So that would be one recommendation, I think. I know that people like other things, but I look at the space. You haven't said how much space you have for planting. You can prune that hydrangea back. A viburnum, for instance, won't work because of the spread of the branching, and which segues to a point, a very important point when we do get back to the garden center, or if you're looking online to order things, look at a couple of things on the plant tag. Very important. What is the spread and height of the plant that you're looking at? And what is its zone? The zone is important because it tells you how hardy it is. And in Ontario, we do get cold winters, so you got to pay attention to hardiness. You can plant tender plants, but you're going to have to look after them a little bit. I don't think roses fit into. Roses are, I would call them a plant that requires a little bit of care. So beside a deck, I would say you're probably wanting something that's going to be easy enough to look after. And I certainly think hydrangea would be a good fallback. Gosh, I'm talking about hydrangea a lot, and I'm sorry, but they're beautiful.
Okay, so on a different line, are drip lines better for grow bag vegetable gardens rather than regular watering?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yes, I agree with you too. It's less water that's going to evaporate or spread to places you don't want it to go.
Well, and so that's one of the questions I got was about rust on a service berry. The thing about rust and mildew, they're often caused by overhead sprinkling, and so you're better off not to sprinkle your gardens, not to water them overhead. Now, and that certainly means that if you're going to water that way, then you better do it, in the morning, so it has all day for the leaves to dry off, because it's watering in the evening and then the night sets in and the leaves don't get dry, and basically you can prevent a lot of disease by just being careful about when you water.
Good. So there's another question. Anna would like to block weeds in her flower beds this year. Do membranes work, or are there better things to use?
Ew, not membranes. Sorry. Yes, I would absolutely use mulch. Absolutely use mulch.
And okay, great question coming back up from Andrew and Sarah. Hardy flowering or non-flowering plants to recommend for Ontario cottages?
That's so funny. Hi, Andrew and Sarah, for those of you online. This is my son and daughter-in-law. Yes, I think ornamental grasses in that particular cottage will work very well. I also think that a hedge of a rose, rose bush, not one of the fancy ones, but a rose hedge would be also very pretty, and certainly a backdrop of ornamental grasses would really look great. I certainly would not do any evergreen hedging. Like wouldn't worry about boxwood. That's way too formal for a cottage. But I think if you did something that would, even spirea, a hedge of spirea would provide you with an incredible show of spring flowers, white hedging of spirea. So those are a couple of suggestions, and I'm happy to talk to you later about that. Before we go on, can we take one of the other questions that came in? This was from Susan about transplanting perennials. And she wanted to know about moving bleeding hearts and poppy plants that she's got in her garden. So first of all, let's talk about, for the most part, you can divide and move perennials in the springtime. You got to know the perennial though, and if it's about to blossom, then obviously that's not the time to move them. You're much better to move a perennial when it's not in bloom. So for instance, the bleeding heart is a kind of a early summer, late spring plant blossomer. So I would move it after it's died back. So late summer, early fall, I would divide it or move it and move it into a position that is similar to the one it was in. It does die back after it's bloomed, so that's I would wait for sure until it's died back. Poppy plant, they have a taproot, so you do have to be a little bit more careful when you're moving poppy plants. So as long as you dig deep, generally speaking, you're digging wider for most others, but as long as you dig deep for the poppy, you'll be able to transplant it easily, be very gentle. That should be moved in September because it blossoms through the summertime. So you don't want to disturb it in the spring. It might affect the blossoms that you get, and that's that would work against what you want in your garden. Okay, sorry, back to you, Helen.
Can you recommend a good ground cover for underneath maple trees with a dense, shallow root system?
Well, that's a really tough question because maple trees really take up both take up all the sun, and they certainly take up all the nutrients, and that's why grass doesn't grow there. It depends if you're going to be walking on it, on this space. I think the earlier suggestion of Pachysandra is a good one. It's an evergreen, and so you're not going to get great blossoms from anything underneath a maple tree. However, the other one would be sweet woodruff, which has a very pretty leaf, and it has a very pretty white flower. Sweet woodruff would work really well as well and would look quite pretty. But I wouldn't plant anything else under there. I would just do one plant and do lots of them and do it in the entire circle around the tree, and that will look lovely.
Thank you. And
there's 33 people in chat. Is that how many questions are on the chat?
No. Some of them are just a thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
So to follow up on that, somebody's asking what the best ground cover that will last in part shade, part sun. So they have tried Baltic ivy and they've tried Pachysandra, and neither have been successful. So you did mention sweet woodruff. I don't know if you have one or two other recommendations.
I'm surprised. Wow, ivy didn't work. And Pachysandra didn't work. Those are like the hardiest and the both the easiest to grow. I'd have to really think about that. The other thing about ground covers is that you need a lot of them to be effective, and so you don't want to buy an expensive plant. The other thing I guess I would do then is if it was me and if it was a prominent garden, like it's at the front yard or whatever, I think I would just edge the bed and mulch it with some shredded cedar. And if appropriate, I would think I would buy a concrete bird bath and put it right underneath the tree and make that the focal point. Forget about trying to grow something that your eye goes to. Just use mulch and put the bird bath in.
Yeah.
That's a design suggestion.
Yeah. Or rocks, good place for rocks.
Rocks or your combination. I mean, a rock, I always find that somebody, plops a big rock down in the middle of in a place that doesn't look like it should be, then you have to, I think you got to do something in combination with the rocks, and you got to do usually more than one, like do 3 and then put some ornamental grasses and yeah.
That sounded like a nice idea, actually. So Margaret has both pink and white hydrangeas in her garden. The white ones have flowered every year, and she cuts them back in the fall. The pink ones, though, seem dormant. They've only flowered once in 10 years. Do you know why that would be?
That seems very odd. Are they getting sun? That would be the question I have.
Yes, Margaret, if you could type in if they get sun and if they're planted close together so we know if they're getting the same conditions, then we might be able to help you with that. So in the meantime, though,
they do need sun. I mean, hydrangea does need sun. I know that, I know there's a lot of people around who have hydrangea planted in shade, but if you want good blossoms, you have to actually, have to give them a bit of sun.
Yes, so she's writing now, some of them aren't getting sun, so maybe that's why.
Okay, well, tell her I will talk to her about that separately.
Okay. We do have a question. Yeah, somebody else has the same hydrangea problem.
Yeah, honestly, I think that for the most part, people, whenever I've been asked about hydrangeas, it's generally because they're not getting enough sun. And you can do a couple of things. You can if it's under a tree, limb up the tree so that sun comes in. Obviously, you're not going to be able to move the sun. But I moved a hydrangea a couple of years ago because I knew it wasn't getting enough sun. It now is much happier in its location, getting way more blossoms. So yeah, I would definitely think about the sun. And for anybody, I don't know if anybody's on that's in a new garden, they've just in a new home. I think that's one of the most important aspects of your garden. When you're in a new place, you should really wait a whole year to figure out what it is that you want to do in your garden. Just because you don't know how the sun travels across the garden, and you got to be familiar with that. And funnily enough, people gravitate towards the sun. So you'll see, people's lawn chairs are moving into the part of the garden where it's sunny and where they're most comfortable. Well, that's where you need to concentrate your efforts. If that's where naturally you're gravitating to, that's where your picnic table is, whatever, then that's where you should have your patio. That's where you build out from that. And this is, basic garden design and trying to decide where you're going to put things in your, brand new virgin garden.
Right. We have a few more quick questions. Hopefully we can get to. Somebody was asking, well, just very quick, are hydrangeas good for privacy if they're by a deck?
No, not really, because they're not an evergreen. And so the only thing you can really do on a deck for privacy is you can do an artificial privacy screen by building a trellis of some kind. That would be one way to provide some immediate privacy. And if you need overhead privacy, if you've got, you've got an apartment building and behind you, for instance, then I would put an arbor on top of your privacy screen, and that will give you some instant privacy. And then of course the other, and then you can plant a hedge, and a cedar hedge works, or a yew hedge would work. The thing with planting like that is that, it takes time. It'll take years for a hedge to grow up and give you enough privacy, which is, why so many people end up building a screen in behind to give them the privacy. They just don't have the time for the hedge to grow and become the screen that you need and that you want.
Okay. Just 3 more questions here. Somebody is asking for advice on how to dig up a big root ball in the garden.
You should have 2 people, and everybody should, both should have a shovel and go as wide as you can, and then basically leverage out the plant. It's you have to, it's a very heavy root ball. I don't know what perennials don't usually get that big. You should be able to dig up a perennial, but if you're trying to move, I know people have tried to move Japanese maples, for instance, and you do need, a very big root ball. And so if you have somebody who can help, that's great. You're going to need 2, probably, 2 very strong people, and then, slide it over onto a tarp and then drag the tarp over to the new location.
Thank you. Are Scillias native species?
Yes.
Good. Good to
Even
know.
though they're called Siberica, they're not from Siberia.
Anna's going back to the membrane. So she was going to consider putting them under decorative stones or pebbles to block weeds. So is that an expensive option, or still just not with the membrane whatsoever?
The problem with the rock as a mulch, because basically that's what you're trying to do. Soil, your leaves, the wind will blow leaves in between the rocks. That will compost and create dirt. And so you end up with weeds in between the stones. And for any of you that have had that kind of cleanup to do, it is a pain in the rear. So I just think that you're better off to do your weeding. You can't get the garden cleaned up, tidied up, weeded, and then I would put down mulch, and I would mulch then every year, and you could probably, you can be weed free effectively. I think the stone does create, it looks really great that first year, but then you will get weeds coming up from between the stones, and that most people find that extremely frustrating. And since we are being sponsored by the Halton Environmental Network, spraying an herbicide to get rid of the weeds is not what you want to do. It's not good for the garden. It's not good for our health. All of that leaches down through the soil when it rains and when you water, and it's just not good. And listen, there's one more question here that I had in advance, which is about an amelanchier that had rust, and that's the serviceberry. I love this plant. I think it's a great woodland shrub, large shrub that has the most incredible white blossoms in early spring. The key with disease like rust on a plant like this is really to clean it up, to prune out all of the affected branches, to remove all of the leaves. They shouldn't really go in the compost. I know that you can read about it, but they shouldn't really go in the compost. They should actually go in the garbage, and because you don't want the rust disease to spread. But now in the spring is the time to make sure that does not reappear on your shrub this summer. So clean up the shrub, clean up the plant, the ground beneath it. Prune out some of the branches that have died and are not looking great. And then here's a classic example. Don't run the sprinkler over top of the leaves. Water it from down below.
Okay, perfect. One last question. So Leslie has a part shade garden, and someone recommended using clover to replace the grass. So not growing in the shade. What do you think?
I don't think that's a great solution. I don't think you'd be happy. Now, there are some grass seeds that have a mix of clover in it. So that's certainly what I would try. I would buy, grass seed that is specifically for shade. And I would try that first before going to all clover. And sometimes you just, I know some gardens on the north, who have north exposure, and then a big tree shading it. So there's, double whammy, no sun whatsoever. It's pretty darn tough. And I would suggest perhaps then really saving up to do artificial turf, because I know it sounds really crazy, and Hen probably will hate me for this, but it does work, and it does look good. So, in the short term or in the long term, if you have a problem with no shade in your back garden and you really want some grass, the fact is grass is one of the most ineffective plants we have. I mean, we have to water it, so we're wasting water. We've got to fertilize it, so we got to, and we've used herbicides on it. I mean, geez, from an environmental perspective, we shouldn't really have grass anywhere, but we do, and we've become used to it. And so it's about learning to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nancy, thank you very much. You have been a wealth of information. I'm sure everybody got something out of this webinar. It has been a tremendous help to all of us gardeners out here. Well, regardless of whether we're stuck at home with COVID or not, this has just been a fountain of information.
I'm very, very pleased to be here. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions and you know how to get a hold of me, don't be afraid to reach out. I'd love to throw this back to my friend Lisa Kohler, from Hen, who invited me to do this, who twisted my arm to get me to do this. It was my pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy, so much. Oh my gosh, I learned a ton. Thank you, Nancy. We're having some requests to have you again, so I'm sure you and I will be chatting later about that. Again, everyone, my name is Lisa. I'm from the Halton Environmental Network, and thank you very much for joining us today on the most amazing call with Nancy Robertson. It was awesome. Just so everyone knows, we do have a website, oakvilleready.ca. We will be posting this webinar to that website in about 24 hours, so you can rewatch it, take notes, etc. There's some other webinars too that might be of interest to you, so please check out our website. If you go to oakvilleready.ca, under General Resources Webinars, you will see all of the previous webinars that we have recorded. In addition, tomorrow we're super excited about the Heart of Oakville Beats On. This is a call that we're doing with the town of Oakville. They're going to be talking to community groups and others that are actually making a difference every day through the COVID pandemic and building in resiliency and talking about how Oakville gives back, and such a great community to live in and to work in. And I'm really excited about these positive stories that we'll be discussing tomorrow. So if you can join us, that's tomorrow again at 1 p.m. If you have an idea for a community call, please remember, reach out to us. You can get a hold of Tricia Henderson at tricia.henderson@oakville.ca, or myself, Lisa Kay at haltonenvironmental.ca. Thank you everyone again for joining us. It was a great webinar. We look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe, be well, and thank you again.